Elon Musk saves stranded family. What happens next will shock you. The rain hadn't stopped for days, turning the quiet suburban neighborhood into a waterlogged maze of stranded cars and submerged homes. The streets, once lined with families walking their dogs or kids riding bikes, were now eerily silent save for the sound of rushing water and the occasional crack of a collapsing fence. Amid the chaos, a single minivan sat half-submerged in the rising floodwaters. Inside, a family of 4 clung to what little hope they had left. The father, soaked to the bone, sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as though it might somehow keep the vehicle afloat. His wife, her arms wrapped tightly around their 2 children, tried to keep their spirits up, but her trembling voice betrayed her growing fear. "Is anyone coming?" The older child, a boy no older than 10, asked. His voice quivered, his wide eyes darting between his mother and the water that now reached the windows. "They'll come," his mother said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Someone will come, but deep down she wasn't so sure. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the streets were empty, abandoned by anyone with the means to flee. They had called for help hours ago, but as time dragged on, their hope dwindled. The father checked his phone for the 100th time, but there was no signal, no updates, just a blank screen that seemed to mock their helplessness. He slammed his hand against the dashboard in frustration, startling his wife and children. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "Why isn't anyone coming?" "Maybe we should try to get out," the mother suggested hesitantly. She glanced at the water, which was now lapping at the edges of the windows. "If we wait any longer, we'll—" A loud knock interrupted her. The entire family froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Another knock followed, more insistent this time. The father turned toward the driver's side window, squinting through the rain-streaked glass. Standing outside, waist-deep in the floodwater, was a man holding a flashlight. His face was partially obscured by the hood of his rain jacket, but there was no mistaking the calm determination in his eyes. He gestured for the family to roll down the window. The father hesitated. "Who is that?" The boy whispered, clutching his mother's arm. "I don't know," she replied, "but he doesn't look like a rescue worker." The man knocked again, this time calling out, "Are you all okay in there?" The father finally cracked the window, allowing the man's voice to carry through the downpour. "We're fine," he said, though the shakiness in his voice suggested otherwise. "But we're stuck. The car won't start, and the water keeps rising." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "You can't stay here," he said simply. "The water's going to get higher, and this car won't keep you safe." "We know that," the father snapped, his frustration boiling over. "But what do you expect us to do? Walk through this?" He gestured to the murky water that surrounded them, filled with debris and who knew what else. "I have a plan," the man said calmly. "But you'll have to trust me." The father narrowed his eyes. "Trust you? We don't even know who you are." The man pulled back his hood, revealing a face that was instantly recognizable, at least to the adults in the car. The mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is that Elon Musk?" The father finished, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared at the man, as if trying to reconcile the billionaire CEO with the figure standing in the floodwaters before him. Elon offered a small smile, though his expression remained serious. "We don't have time for introductions," he said. "You have 2 choices. Stay here and hope the water doesn't rise any further, or follow me. I can get you to safety." The family exchanged uncertain glances. The father, still skeptical, asked, "Why are you even here? Shouldn't you be on a private jet somewhere, far away from all this?" "I was in the area," Elon replied, his tone matter of fact, "and I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Now, are you coming or not?" The mother placed a hand on her husband's arm, her voice pleading. "We don't have any other options. We have to trust him." The father hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, let's go." Elon wasted no time. He directed the family to climb out of the van, helping each of them navigate the swirling waters. The children clung to their parents, their small faces pale with fear, while the mother held tightly to Elon's arm for support. As they waded through the floodwaters, the father couldn't help but cast suspicious glances at Elon. He still wasn't sure what to make of the man who had appeared out of nowhere, offering help when no one else had. Was this some kind of publicity stunt? Or was he genuinely trying to make a difference? Whatever the case, there was no turning back now. The family trudged through the floodwaters behind Elon, their movements slow and unsteady. The water was colder than they'd expected, sending shivers through their soaked clothes. Every step felt like a gamble, the murky water hiding debris and unpredictable currents beneath its surface. The father, still clutching his youngest child, glanced nervously at Elon's steady figure leading the way. Despite the dire situation, he couldn't shake his skepticism. "What's the plan, exactly?" he called out, his voice laced with doubt. Elon turned slightly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. "There's a dry area up ahead," he said. "I parked my vehicle there. It's high enough to stay safe from the flood." The father raised an eyebrow. "Your vehicle? What, some million-dollar prototype? How's that supposed to help us?" The tone wasn't lost on Elon, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pressed forward, his focus unwavering. The mother shot her husband a warning look, silently pleading with him to drop the attitude. "Not now," she whispered. "Let's just get out of here." But the father wasn't done. His frustration, fueled by the chaos of the day, bubbled over. "You're acting like this guy is some kind of hero," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for his wife to hear. "He's probably just here for the publicity." "Would you stop?" she snapped, her voice low but firm. "He's helping us. That's more than anyone else has done." Their quiet argument was interrupted by the older child's cry of alarm. "Dad, there's something in the water." Everyone froze. The beam of Elon's flashlight swung toward the boy, illuminating a dark shape floating toward them. It was a large piece of debris, a section of a fence, jagged and splintered, carried by the current. It was moving fast, directly toward the group. "Move!" Elon barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. He grabbed the boy's arm, pulling him out of the way just as the debris smashed into a nearby car with a sickening crunch. The impact sent ripples through the water, nearly knocking the family off their feet. The father clutched his youngest child tighter, his heart racing. "That could have been us," he muttered, his bravado faltering for the first time. Elon steadied the boy, his grip firm but reassuring. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "The water's unpredictable. We need to move quickly." The group continued, the tension palpable. The mother clung to her daughter, her eyes darting nervously around the dark water. The father, despite his lingering doubts, kept his mouth shut. For now, as they moved, the current grew stronger, pulling at their legs with increasing force. The younger child began to cry, her small voice trembling with fear. "Mommy, I'm scared." "I know, sweetie," the mother said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just hold on to me. We're almost there." Elon turned back to them, his expression softening for the first time. "She's right," he said. "We're close. Just a little further." But as they pressed on, the father's frustration began to creep back in. He was cold, exhausted, and increasingly unsure of their guide. "You keep saying we're close," he muttered, his voice sharp, "but we're still wading through this mess. Are you sure you even know where you're going?" Elon stopped abruptly, turning to face the man. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the father's scowling face, and for a moment, the two men locked eyes. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't sure," Elon said, his tone steady but firm. "But if you think you can do better, you're welcome to try." The father opened his mouth to respond, but the mother cut him off. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "This isn't about you. This is about keeping our kids safe. So either help or keep quiet." The tension hung thick in the air as the father glared at Elon, his pride bruised. But he said nothing, his silence an unspoken admission of defeat. The group continued, the floodwaters swirling around them as they pushed forward. After what felt like an eternity, They reached a section of higher ground. Elon's vehicle, a rugged, all-terrain model, was parked on the incline, its headlights cutting through the rain. The family stumbled onto the dry patch, their legs aching from the strain of wading through the water. "Get in," Elon said, unlocking the doors. "I'll take you somewhere safe." The mother wasted no time, ushering the children into the back seat. The father hesitated, his skepticism flaring once more. "This thing better work," he muttered under his breath, climbing into the passenger seat. Elon didn't respond. He climbed into the driver's seat, his movements efficient and focused. As the engine roared to life, the father couldn't help but glance at the dashboard. His curiosity piqued despite himself. "What is this thing anyway?" he asked, his tone begrudgingly curious. "Some kind of prototype?" "It's a Cybertruck," Elon replied, his attention on the road ahead. "Modified for situations like this." The father raised an eyebrow. "Situations like this? You mean floods?" "Disasters," Elon clarified. "Natural or otherwise." The vehicle moved steadily through the water, its design perfectly suited for the harsh conditions. The mother, sitting in the back with her children, let out a shaky sigh of relief. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for helping us." Elon glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "This is what we should do for each other." The father scoffed, crossing his arms. Spoken like a guy who doesn't have to worry about anything, Elon didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he focused on navigating the treacherous terrain, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the father's simmering frustration. But the tension between the two men was far from resolved, and as the vehicle pressed on, it became clear that the real test was yet to come. The Cybertruck forged through the floodwaters with ease, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The mother sat in the back seat, cradling her younger child while the older one leaned against her shoulder. The father, in the passenger seat, tapped his fingers against the door, his impatience growing with every passing minute. Elon's calm demeanor seemed to aggravate him even more. "So, what's the big plan after this?" the father asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "You're going to drop us off somewhere? Take a few photos for your PR team, and call it a day?" The mother shot him a glare. "Can you stop? He's helping us." "I'm just saying," the father retorted. "Guys like him don't just show up out of nowhere without an angle. You really think he's here out of the goodness of his heart?" Elon kept his eyes on the road ahead, steering the vehicle through the turbulent waters. He didn't respond to the jab, but the mother wasn't as restrained. "Maybe he's here because he's a decent human being," she said sharply. "Something you could learn from." The father let out a bitter laugh. "Oh sure, let's all bow down to the billionaire savior. Like he even knows what it's like to struggle." "Enough," Elon said suddenly, his voice calm but firm. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the argument instantly. "We're in a dangerous situation. Your focus should be on keeping your family safe, not on trying to pick a fight." The father crossed his arms, grumbling under his breath, but he didn't say anything else. The mother leaned back in her seat, her tension momentarily easing. The children, sensing the change in tone, remained quiet, their wide eyes fixed on the swirling water outside the windows. As they continued, the Cybertruck jolted suddenly, hitting a submerged object. The impact wasn't severe, but it sent a ripple of fear through the vehicle's occupants. "What was that?" the mother asked, her voice trembling. "Debris," Elon replied calmly. "Probably a branch or a piece of furniture. Nothing to worry about." "Nothing to worry about," the father snapped. "You sure about that? Or are we just supposed to take your word for it?" Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowed the vehicle, carefully navigating around the obstruction. "If you have a better idea," he said finally, his tone even, "feel free to share it." The father opened his mouth to retort but closed it again, realizing he had nothing to offer. The mother sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Can we please just focus on getting out of here alive?" The tension in the vehicle was palpable, but Elon's steady presence seemed to keep it from boiling over completely. The The father, however, was clearly struggling to contain his frustration. He shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath. "You know," he said after a moment, "this whole situation could have been avoided if the city had done its job. Proper drainage systems, flood prevention measures, basic stuff. But no, let's just wait for a disaster to happen and then hope someone like Musk shows up to save the day. Blaming the city doesn't help us now," Elon said, his voice calm but firm. "What matters is getting your family to safety." "Oh, so now you're the hero," the father shot back, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The guy who swoops in and pretends to care while the rest of us deal with the mess." The mother put a hand on his arm, her voice low and urgent. "Stop it, please." But the father wasn't done. His anger, fueled by exhaustion and fear, spilled over. "You think you're better than us?" he demanded, turning to glare at Elon. "You think your money makes you some kind of savior? Newsflash, it doesn't. You don't know anything about what we're going through." Elon glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said simply. "I don't know what you're going through, but I know what it looks like to let anger get in the way of what matters." The father scoffed, shaking his head. "Spare me the life lessons." The vehicle hit another patch of debris, jolting slightly. The mother tightened her grip on the children, her face pale. "Can we not do this right now?" she pleaded. "We have kids in the car." The father fell silent, but his frustration was evident in the way he stared out the window, his jaw clenched. Elon, meanwhile, remained focused on the task at hand. The water was getting deeper, the current stronger, but the Cybertruck held steady, its design perfectly suited for the harsh conditions. As they approached a bend in the road, a faint light appeared in the distance. It was a street lamp, its base partially submerged but still casting a faint glow through the rain. Beyond it, a building loomed, a community center that had been converted into an emergency shelter. "There," Elon said, pointing toward the structure. "That's where we're headed." The mother let out a sigh of relief, but the father remained skeptical. "Great. Another PR opportunity for you." "Maybe," Elon said, his tone neutral. "Or maybe it's just a place where your family can be safe." The father didn't respond, but his expression remained sour. The mother, sensing the tension, reached over to squeeze his hand. "We're almost there," she said softly. "Just a little longer." The Cybertruck pushed through the final stretch of water, the building growing closer with each passing moment. But the father's skepticism lingered, his distrust of Elon overshadowing the relief of reaching safety. And though the journey was nearing its end, the true test of character was yet to come. As the Cybertruck reached the outer edge of the emergency shelter's parking lot, the scene outside grew clearer. Flooded cars were abandoned in the waterlogged streets, some tilted at odd angles, their owners long gone. The faint glow of the shelter's lights offered a flicker of hope, but the parking lot itself was chaotic. People waded through the rising water, carrying what little they could salvage, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Elon parked the vehicle on the highest ground available and turned off the engine. "This is it," he said, glancing back at the family. "We'll need to walk the rest of the way." The mother nodded, pulling the children closer. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. She reached for the door handle, but the father stopped her. "Hold on," he said, his tone sharp. "Before we go running into another mess, maybe we should figure out what we're walking into. For all we know, this shelter could be full, or worse, a madhouse." Elon looked at him evenly. "It's a risk, but it's safer than staying in the truck." The water is still rising. The father leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. "Great. So we're trading one problem for another." "Perfect." The mother shot him a glare. "Would you stop? He's done more for us in the past hour than anyone else has." "Oh, come on," the father snapped. "You really think this guy's some kind of saint? Look at him. He's just another rich guy playing hero so he can pat himself on the back later." "Enough," Elon said, his tone calm but firm. "We don't have time for this. If you're not coming, I'll take your family inside myself." The father bristled at the remark, his pride stung. "Don't act like you're in charge here. I'm not, Elon replied, his gaze steady. But I'm responsible for getting you to safety. That's all that matters right now. The father's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. He opened his door with a huff, stepping out into the knee-deep water. The rest of the family followed, the children clinging tightly to their mother as they made their way toward the shelter. The closer they got, the more chaotic the scene became. A long line of people waited at the entrance, their voices rising in frustration as volunteers tried to maintain order. Some were soaked to the bone, clutching makeshift bundles of belongings, while others stood empty-handed, their faces blank with shock. "This is a nightmare," the father muttered, his irritation growing with every step. "We'll be standing here all night." Elon scanned the line, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward, addressing one of the volunteers. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. The young woman looked up, her face flushed from stress. "We're at capacity," she said, her voice shaking. "We're trying to redirect people to another shelter, but..." Her words trailed off as she took in Elon's face, recognition dawning. "Wait, are you?" "There's no time for that," Elon said quickly, cutting her off. "Is there any room left at all?" The volunteer hesitated, glancing back at the shelter. "Maybe for a few more, but we're stretched thin. Supplies are running out, and we don't have enough staff." Elon nodded, his mind working quickly. He turned back to the family. "Stay here," he said. "I'll figure something out." "Figure something out?" the father repeated, his skepticism evident. "What does that even mean?" "It means I'm not giving up," Elon replied, his tone firm. "Unlike you." The remark hit a nerve. The father's face flushed with anger. But before he could respond, Elon was already moving toward the shelter. The mother placed a hand on her husband's arm, her voice low and urgent. "Can you stop fighting him for once? He's trying to help." The father shrugged her off, his frustration boiling over. "Help? He thinks he's better than us. That's all this is. Some kind of power trip." The mother sighed, exhaustion etched into her features. "Maybe he is better than us," she said quietly. "At least he's doing something." Her words silenced him, but only for a moment. "Oh, sure," he muttered under his breath. "Let's all worship Saint Elon." Meanwhile, Elon approached the shelter's entrance, speaking quietly with the staff. The volunteers nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. Within minutes, they began ushering people inside, making room for the family and a handful of others. "Come on," Elon called, gesturing for the family to follow. "They've made space for you." The mother didn't hesitate, guiding the children toward the entrance. The father, however, lingered behind, his arms crossed. "What's the catch?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "There's no catch," Elon replied. "Just go inside." The father scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. Nothing's ever that simple." "Suit yourself," Elon said, turning away. "But your family's going in with or without you." The remark stung, and the father knew it. Reluctantly, he followed, muttering under his breath about ego trips and billionaire saviors. Inside, the shelter was crowded but organized. Volunteers handed out blankets and water bottles, their movements efficient despite the chaos. The mother found a corner for the children to sit, wrapping them in the blankets and whispering reassurances. Elon stood nearby, speaking quietly with a group of volunteers. The father watched him warily, his skepticism undiminished. "What's he doing now?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Helping," the mother replied curtly. "You should try it sometime." The father opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he watched as Elon moved through the shelter, his presence commanding but unassuming. Despite his doubts, the father couldn't help but feel a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Resentment, perhaps, or maybe guilt. But whatever it wasn't enough to change his mind. Not yet. The shelter buzzed with an uneasy energy, a mix of gratitude and desperation. Families huddled together, some clutching the few belongings they had managed to save, while others stared blankly into the middle distance, the weight of the disaster etched on their faces. Volunteers darted between groups, distributing food, water, and blankets, their faces showing signs of exhaustion. The father leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. His face was a mask of disdain, and his eyes followed Elon as he moved through the room, speaking with staff and organizing supplies. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. The mother, sitting on the floor with the children, looked up at him with a weary expression. "What now?" "This whole thing," he said, gesturing toward Elon. "It's a show. He's playing the hero for all these people, but I guarantee you he's got cameras somewhere, recording everything for his PR team." The mother shook her head, disbelief flashing across her face. "Do you even hear yourself? You'd rather believe he's faking it than admit he's actually helping." "Helping?" the father scoffed. "Oh, please. People like him don't do anything without an angle." The older child, sitting quietly next to his mother, finally spoke up. "Why are you so mad at him, Dad?" The question caught the father off guard. He hesitated, his face softening for a moment before his frustration returned. "I'm not mad," he said quickly. "I'm just not fooled. That's all." "Does it matter if he's fooling you?" the mother asked, her voice low but sharp. "He got us out of the flood. He got us here. That's more than anyone else did." The father opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he glanced at Elon, who was now speaking with a group of volunteers near the entrance. His calm demeanor and focused expression grated on the father's nerves. A sudden commotion near the shelter entrance drew everyone's attention. A man, soaked and angry, barged inside, his voice raised in frustration. "Where's the food?" he demanded, shoving past a volunteer. "We've been out there for hours, and you've got people sitting in here with sandwiches?" "Sir, please calm down," one of the volunteers said, trying to placate him. "We're doing our best to distribute supplies fairly." "Fairly?" the man shouted. "I saw people getting food when I walked in. Don't tell me it's fair." Elon stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What's your name?" The man turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "What does it matter to you?" "It matters," Elon replied evenly, "because we're trying to help everyone here, including you. But yelling at the volunteers isn't going to speed things up." The man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Elon's directness. I'm tired, okay? My wife and kids are out there waiting, and we don't have anything left." "I understand," Elon said, his voice softening, "and we'll get you what you need, but you have to let us do our job." The man nodded reluctantly, his anger subsiding. Elon turned to the volunteers and gave them quiet instructions. Within minutes, a small package of food and water was handed to the man, who left without another word. The father watched the exchange with a mix of annoyance and grudging respect. "Great," he muttered. "Now he's the mediator, too." The mother sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Why do you hate him so much? What did he ever do to you?" "It's not about him," the father snapped. "It's about people like him. They think they can fix everything with money and good intentions, but they don't understand what it's like to be us." "And what are you doing to fix anything?" The mother shot back, her voice rising. "Complaining? Picking fights? What good does that do?" Their argument was interrupted by the sound of a child crying. It was coming from a corner of the room where a young boy sat alone, clutching a tattered stuffed animal. His face was streaked with tears, and his small frame trembled with sobs. Elon noticed immediately and walked over, kneeling down to the boy's level. "Hey," he said gently, "what's your name?" The boy sniffled, clutching the stuffed animal tighter. "Tommy," he said quietly. "Hi, Tommy," Elon said with a small smile. "Where's your family?" Tommy pointed toward the entrance. "My mom went to get food, but she's not back yet." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you want to come sit with me until she gets back?" Tommy hesitated, then nodded slowly. Elon stood and offered his hand, guiding the boy to a quieter corner of the room. The father watched the interaction, his arms still crossed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "He's just showing off," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Or maybe he's just a decent person," the mother replied, her tone pointed. Not that you'd recognize that. The father ignored her, but her words lingered. As he stood there, watching Elon talk quietly with the boy, a small part of him began to wonder if he had been wrong. But his pride wouldn't let him admit it, not yet. The shelter settled into an uneasy calm as the night wore on. Volunteers continued their work, and families huddled together, finding what comfort they could in each other's presence. Elon remained a steady presence, moving through the room with purpose, his actions speaking louder than any words. But for the father, every act of kindness felt like a challenge, a reminder of his own inaction. And as much as he wanted to dismiss Elon's efforts as hollow gestures, he couldn't shake the growing sense that there was more to the man than he had assumed. The tension simmered, unresolved, as the father wrestled with his conflicting emotions. And though the night was far from over, it was clear that the true test of character, for everyone involved, was still to come. As the hours wore on, the atmosphere in the shelter became tense. The limited supplies were running out quickly, and the volunteers were struggling to keep everyone calm. Parents tried to soothe their restless children, while others whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the doors as if expecting the floodwaters to breach the building at any moment. The father sat alone near the wall, his arms still crossed and his face set in a scowl. Despite the relative safety of the shelter, his frustration hadn't waned. If anything, it had grown. Watching Elon move through the room, calmly organizing relief efforts and comforting strangers, only stoked his resentment. "He's not a hero," the father muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with bitterness. "He's just another rich guy trying to make himself look good." Across the room, Elon was speaking with the volunteers, his tone steady but urgent. The mother, seated with the children, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. She glanced over at her husband, who was now muttering to himself, his expression dark. "Are you really going to sit there and sulk all night?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "He's helping people. Why can't you just accept that?" The father's head snapped toward her, his jaw tightening. "I don't trust him," he said. "People like him don't do things out of the kindness of their hearts. They do it for attention, for control." "Maybe," the mother said, her tone sharp. "Or maybe he's just doing what you're too proud to do. Helping." Before the father could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A volunteer rushed into the room, her face pale and her voice shaking as she called for Elon. "We've got a situation," she said. Elon immediately moved toward her, his posture alert. "What's happening?" he asked. "There's a group of people outside," the volunteer explained. "They're demanding to be let in, but we're at capacity. We don't have the resources for more people." The room buzzed with nervous whispers as Elon nodded, his expression calm but focused. "I'll handle it," he said, his voice steady. As he headed toward the entrance, the father couldn't resist a snide remark. "Of course, can't miss a chance to play the hero." The mother glared at him. "Why don't you try helping for once?" The father ignored her, standing and following Elon toward the entrance. He stayed a few steps behind, watching as Elon stepped outside into the cold night air. A group of soaked and desperate people stood just beyond the shelter doors, their faces lined with fear and frustration. "You can't just leave us out here," one man shouted, his voice cracking. "We've got kids." "We're not leaving you out here," Elon said, his voice calm but firm. "We're figuring out a solution." "What solution?" another person demanded. "There's no room in there, and we're running out of time." Elon held up a hand, his steady demeanor cutting through the rising panic. "I understand," he said, "and we'll find a way to help everyone. But I need you to trust me." The father watched from the doorway, his arms crossed. "Good luck with that," he muttered. "You can't fix everything, Musk." Ignoring him, Elon turned to the volunteers who had gathered near the doors. "Start setting up an overflow area," he instructed. "Use the open lot next door. We'll need tarps, blankets, and whatever food we can spare." "We don't have enough supplies for that," one volunteer said, her voice tinged with worry. "Then we'll bring more," Elon replied. "I'll make the calls. Just get it started." The volunteers hesitated, then nodded, moving quickly to carry out his instructions. The father let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. He really thinks he can just snap his fingers and fix everything. Elon turned to him, his gaze steady. You don't have to like me, he said. But if you're not going to help, at least get out of the way. The father bristled at the remark. His pride stung. Help with what? He snapped. Your little PR stunt? This isn't about me, Elon said, his tone firm but calm. It's about these people. People who are scared, hungry, and desperate. If you can't see that, then maybe the problem isn't with me. The father opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he felt a flicker of shame, though he quickly buried it beneath his frustration. Whatever, he muttered, turning away. As Elon moved back into the shelter to make the necessary calls, the father lingered near the entrance, his thoughts swirling. He watched as the volunteers began setting up the overflow area, their movements quick and efficient despite the cold and the rising water. The people outside waited anxiously, their faces a mix of hope and fear. The father's gaze fell on a young boy standing with his parents, his small hands clutching a tattered blanket. The boy's eyes were wide and scared, and for a moment, the father saw his own children in that terrified expression. The thought made his chest tighten, but he quickly shook it off. Inside, Elon was on the phone, his voice calm but urgent as he coordinated the delivery of additional supplies. The father watched him from a distance, his resentment now mingled with something he couldn't quite name. Despite himself, he couldn't deny the man's determination, his refusal to give up even in the face of overwhelming odds. The mother approached him, her expression tired but resolute. Do you see it now? She asked quietly. See what? He muttered, avoiding her gaze. That he's not the enemy, she said. The only person standing in the way right now is you. Her words hit harder than he expected, and for a moment he couldn't respond. Instead, he stood there in silence, watching as Elon continued to work tirelessly to help people he didn't even know. And though he wouldn't admit it, not yet, the cracks in his stubborn pride were beginning to show. The atmosphere in the shelter shifted as the night wore on. The chaotic buzz began to give way to a steady hum of movement, an unspoken acknowledgement that everyone, volunteers, families, and even the most cynical onlookers, had a part to play in weathering this disaster. The overflow area outside was taking shape, with makeshift tents and tarps creating pockets of dry space for the growing crowd of displaced people. Elon stood near the center of it all, giving quiet instructions to volunteers and checking in with those seeking refuge. His presence, calm and steady, seemed to anchor the scene, even as the floodwaters continued to rise just beyond the parking lot. Inside the shelter, the father watched him from a distance, his arms crossed as usual. But this time, his expression wasn't one of disdain. It was conflicted, a mixture of lingering skepticism and something softer, reluctant admiration, perhaps, though he'd never admit it. The mother, seated with the children, noticed his silence. You've been awfully quiet, she said, her voice low. The father didn't respond right away. Instead, he nodded toward Elon. He's still out there, he muttered. Hasn't stopped moving since we got here. Maybe that should tell you something, the mother said, her tone pointed. He glanced at her, his jaw tightening. Don't start. I'm not starting anything, she replied. I'm just saying, maybe it's time you stopped tearing him down and started looking at what he's actually doing. The father sighed, running a hand through his hair. I just don't get it, he said finally. Why does he care so much? What's in it for him? Maybe nothing, the mother said. Maybe he just cares because someone has to. The father didn't respond, but her words lingered. He looked back toward Elon, who was now kneeling beside an elderly woman in the overflow area, helping her adjust the blanket draped over her shoulders. The sight made something in his chest tighten, though he couldn't quite name the feeling. A sudden commotion near the shelter doors snapped him out of his thoughts. One of the volunteers rushed inside, her voice urgent. We've got a problem, she said, addressing Elon. He stood immediately, his posture alert. What is it? The water's rising faster than we thought, she explained. If it keeps going at this rate, the overflow area won't hold. The father felt a pang of panic, though he tried to hide it. What does that mean? He asked, his voice sharper than he intended. It means we need to move people to higher ground, Elon said, his tone calm but firm. He turned to the volunteers. Start organizing groups. Prioritize families with children and elderly first. I'll take the lead. The father scoffed, though the sound lacked its usual bite. Of course you will, he muttered under his breath. But this time, the mother didn't glare at him or try to argue. Instead, she stood, gathering the children and preparing to move. Come on, she said, her voice steady. We're not staying here. The father hesitated, his pride warring with his instincts. Finally, he nodded and followed her toward the doors. Outside, the situation was worsening. The floodwaters were inching closer to the shelter, the current stronger and more menacing than before. Volunteers moved quickly, guiding families and individuals toward a nearby hill that offered relative safety. Elon stood at the edge of the water, directing the efforts with a calm authority that seemed to cut through the panic. The father stayed close to his family, his eyes darting between the rising water and the volunteers. Despite his lingering doubts, he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for Elon's composure. Is this guy for real? He muttered to the mother as they moved. Doesn't he ever stop? She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Maybe he doesn't have to, she said finally. Maybe he's exactly what these people need right now. The father frowned, but he didn't argue. Instead, he focused on keeping the children close as they made their way toward the hill. The mother glanced back at Elon, who was now helping a group of volunteers secure a makeshift raft to transport supplies. As they reached the base of the hill, a young volunteer approached them, her face pale but determined. We need help carrying supplies, she said, addressing the father. Can you lend a hand? He hesitated, his instinct to refuse clashing with the urgency in her voice. Finally, he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. Yeah, sure, he said. The volunteer led him back toward the shelter, where a group of people were loading crates of water bottles and medical supplies onto the raft. Elon was there, his sleeves rolled up and his focus unwavering as he directed the efforts. The father joined the group, his movements stiff at first but gradually growing more fluid as he worked alongside the others. He didn't speak to Elon, but he couldn't help stealing glances at him, watching as the man moved with a quiet determination that seemed unshakable. As they loaded the last of the supplies onto the raft, Elon turned to the father. Thanks for helping, he said simply, his tone sincere. The father shrugged, avoiding his gaze. Yeah, well, someone had to. Elon nodded, his expression unreadable. You're right, he said. Someone always has to. The words lingered, sinking deeper than the father wanted to admit. He turned away, focusing on the task at hand, but the weight of Elon's presence was impossible to ignore. As the group began moving toward the hill, the father found himself walking alongside Elon. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the sound of rushing water and hurried footsteps. Finally, the father broke the silence. Why do you do this? He asked, his voice low. You could be anywhere else doing anything else. Why bother? Elon glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. Because I can, he said simply. And because if I don't, who will? The father didn't respond, but the words hit him harder than he expected. He looked ahead, his gaze fixed on the hill, and for the first time that night, he felt something shift. A crack in the wall of resentment and pride he had built around himself. The group reached the hill, the volunteers working quickly to set up another temporary shelter. The father stayed close to his family, his thoughts swirling as he watched Elon continue to work, his focus unwavering. And though the night wasn't over, the father knew one thing for certain. He would never see the man in the same way again. The early hours of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a pale light over the hilltop shelter. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air cool and heavy with moisture. Families huddled together, some sitting on damp blankets while others dozed off in exhaustion. Despite the chaos of the night, There was an undeniable sense of relief in the air. The worst of the flooding had passed, and though the recovery would take time, they had made it through. Elon Musk stood at the edge of the hill, overlooking the submerged town below. His face was calm, but his eyes reflected the weight of what had transpired. Around him, volunteers worked tirelessly to distribute supplies, check on the injured, and offer comfort to those in need. His phone buzzed with updates from his team, who were coordinating larger-scale relief efforts from afar. The father sat nearby with his family, his arms draped loosely over his knees. He watched Elon silently, the events of the night replaying in his mind. For the first time, his cynicism had been replaced with something else, humility. He couldn't deny what he had witnessed. A man who could have easily turned away, who had every reason to stay detached, had instead thrown himself into the chaos without hesitation. "I don't get it," the father muttered, breaking the silence. The mother glanced at him, her expression soft but weary. "What don't you get?" "Why he cares so much," the father said, nodding toward Elon. "He's got everything. He doesn't need to do any of this." The mother smiled faintly, resting a hand on his arm. "Maybe that's exactly why he does it," she said. "Because he knows he can." The father looked at her, his jaw tightening as he considered her words. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped as Elon approached them, his steps deliberate but unassuming. "How's everyone doing?" Elon asked, his tone gentle. The mother nodded. "We're okay. Thanks to you." Elon shook his head slightly. "It wasn't just me," he said. "A lot of people stepped up tonight." The father hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Look, I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low. "I misjudged you." Elon smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "You're not the first," he said simply, "and you probably won't be the last." The father chuckled dryly, scratching the back of his neck. "Still, I was wrong. About you, about everything." Elon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do next." The father met his gaze, and for the first time, he felt a genuine sense of respect for the man standing before him. He extended a hand, and Elon shook it without hesitation. As the morning light grew stronger, the shelter began to come alive with movement. Relief teams arrived with additional supplies, and the process of organizing evacuations to safer locations began. Elon stayed at the center of it all, ensuring that no one was overlooked and that every detail was accounted for. Before long, buses arrived to transport the families to temporary housing. The father and mother gathered their belongings, guiding the children toward the waiting vehicles. As they prepared to leave, the father paused, looking back at Elon. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. Elon nodded, his expression warm but focused. "Take care of your family," he said. "That's all the thanks I need." The father nodded, then turned and followed his family onto the bus. As they settled into their seats, the mother leaned over, her voice soft but firm. "Do you see it now?" The father sighed, looking out the window as the shelter grew smaller in the distance. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I see it." Weeks later, the father sat at the kitchen table in their temporary housing, scrolling through his phone. News of the flood and the subsequent recovery efforts dominated the headlines, but one story in particular caught his eye. Elon Musk leads grassroots relief efforts, inspires nationwide support. The article detailed how Elon's actions during the disaster had sparked a wave of generosity, with thousands of people donating money, supplies, and time to help those affected. The father set his phone down, his thoughts drifting back to that night. He thought of the people huddled in the shelter, the volunteers working tirelessly, and the quiet determination in Elon's eyes as he waded through the chaos. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. He looked up as the mother entered the room, carrying a cup of coffee. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, setting the mug down in front of him. He shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just how wrong I was." The mother smiled, her eyes soft. "It's never too late to change." The father nodded, his smile growing. "No," he said quietly, "it's not. This story of Elon Musk stepping into a disaster zone to help stranded families is more than just a tale of heroism. It's a lesson for all of us about the power of taking action, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Elon's relentless effort to help, despite having every reason to stay detached, reminds us of the impact one person can have when they choose to care. How often do we find ourselves thinking, someone else will step up, or it's not my problem? This story challenges that mindset. It shows us that being a leader isn't about having power or influence. It's about using what you have, however big or small, to make a difference. Elon didn't wait for someone else to act. He saw a need and responded, proving that kindness and determination can ripple through an entire community. The father's journey is equally important. His initial skepticism, rooted in pride and assumptions, mirrors what many of us feel when we're quick to judge others. But as he witnessed Elon's actions, his perspective shifted, teaching us that it's never too late to admit we're wrong and grow from the experience. So what can we take away from this? Simple. Compassion is contagious. When you help someone, you inspire others to do the same. Whether you're volunteering, donating, or simply offering a kind word, your actions matter. If this story moved you, consider how you can make a difference in your community. Leave a comment below about a time you helped someone, or when someone helped you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the incredible things we can achieve when we choose kindness over indifference. Let's keep the conversation going.